Good afternoon. I'm Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's virtual presentation on housing and infrastructure provision for informal settlements, comparing Accra and Buenos Aires. Let me begin by acknowledging this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Neptis Foundation, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I would also like to thank the School of Cities for funding IMFG's Post-Doctoral Fellowship this year. And lastly, I would like to thank Piali at IMFG and Daria and Adam, who are at the Monk School, for everything they are doing and did to make this event run smoothly today. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. Today's event is the second seminar by our 2021-2022 postdoctoral fellow, Andrew Wang. You may recall that Andrew presented last October on his research on the self-help approach of residents in informal settlements in Accra. Today, Andrew will be presenting his findings from his research on informal settlement policies in two capital cities in the Global South. He'll be talking again about Accra in Ghana, but also Buenos Aires in Argentina. As he will show in his presentation, they have taken very different approaches to the provision of housing and infrastructure in their informal settlements. He will talk about the different policies at the national and local levels in each country and explain the reasons for the different approaches and different results. Andrew will speak for about 40 minutes this afternoon, and then we will move into a Q&A. You'll see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please send in your questions through that Q&A at any time during the talk. You don't have to wait until the end. You can start sending them in right away. Let me introduce Andrew. As I mentioned, Andrew is the 21-22 IMFG Postdoctoral Fellow. He holds a Doctor of Sustainable Urbanism from Washington University in St. Louis. His area of interest is looking at spatial inequality through different perspectives, scales, and themes to interpret how they may affect the broader pursuit of urban sustainability. Previously, Andrew was a professional urban planner in the Urban Development Bureau of Kaohsiung City, focusing on brownfield redevelopment and urban renewal. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. You can hear me, right? All right. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. Sure. I assume that you can see the full screen, right? So
yep, it's good.
Sure. Thanks to Ine for the welcome, and that was really nice. And good to see you, everyone. My name is Hsi-Chuan Wang, and you can call me by Andrew. And I started my postdoc here last September, and I have much to talk about this experience, but I will leave them to the end of the talk. Today, I'm going to share a paper that I developed for this postdoc titled, as Ine has talked about, housing and infrastructure provision from the policy perspective to look at two cities. So this is my agenda. I will start by address a little bit on the questions I want to know, and then I will move on to the backgrounds to give a little bit backgrounds to know why it is critical to ask these questions. Then touch a little bit on my methods, and with two particular dimensions, cultural variables and structural constraints, as a major dimensions I'm going to look into. And then I will address a little bit on the discussion and learning and to do my conclusion. The question I pose is, what is the cultural context and the structural constraints that have made Accra's informal settlements and interventions different from Buenos Aires? So that basically lay out two inquiry. One is like how the informal settlements are different between the places. And secondly, that what's the policy be drawn and implemented in the cities and make a difference. So in the end of the day, my hope is really about drawing what's the lessons we can learn from these cases, not just between them, but also for the other countries as well. But before we dive into it, I think it's interesting to know a little bit about the background. Globally, there is currently 1 billion people living in so-called informal settlements or slum, basically determined through the provisions of infrastructure or housing provisions per se. And this number is going to be 3 billion by 2030. So this magnitude of growth essentially triggered from local governments to the international actors trying to know how do we allocate adequate housing and infrastructure investments to make sure everyone has a good quality of life. So that's basically the driver is leading to this research. My motivation behind is try to know how do we better intervene through this kind of mutual learning upon the comparison between the cases. However, informality itself could also be triggered by a little bit backgrounds or understanding on literature. Originally, it was kind of defined through Keith Hart and also Kim Dovey, thinking about the under-table economy activities. That's kind of off the records. But however, you can also think of informality as a way of mobilization, urbanizations, as Ananya Roy has defined, and thinking about that's just a type of the living style that we haven't experienced in our life. However, according to Professor Richard Grant, it can also be understood as a deploy of the strategies for your living. So in this process, there will be winners and losers. And to Grant, the winners is try to understand so-called like some sort of the informal rules that you can follow to help you getting whatever you want to have. So that's sort of the informal way of doing your as a strategies. To the loser, somehow it's kind of being eradicated, marginalized out of the housing or formal job opportunities. So that's the two way of thinking that. Internationally, there has been calling for this research focusing on material perspective on the informal settlements. There has been growing calling from the international players thinking about how do we doing effective interventions. Two of the examples are here. One of them is adopted by the United Nations in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goal, thinking about how do we provide adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services for all by 2030. And later on in 2016, the New Urban Agenda further argued that there will be necessary to allocate a sufficient financial and human resources to do all the upgrading project. I think that's a kind of growing international call, and that was clear. However, what was tricky is like, how does that be translated into the project happening in the ground? I see it with two ways. If you see informal settlements as a problem to be solved, that could probably trigger the city leaders to thinking about how about let's build new one. This case was in Kigali, and the mayor see that the informal settlement on your left as a scattering shack that can be eradicated, replaced, and provided with formal housing as what you can see on the right. This type of the high-rise apartment, also different open spaces to improve the living quality. The oppositions against this idea is kind of calling from growing scholars thinking about would there be any other possibility, other ways in addition to eradication? So the key word when it comes to like recognitions, enablement, empower the households to house themselves. And in the end of the day, integrate it with the city fabrics. And there is not necessarily right or wrong in which context. It's just based on local context to decide what approach would make the best. the debate is still on. For this research, for the comparison, from the methodological perspective, I borrow the idea of experimental comparison, which is argued by Lencioni and McFarland earlier in 2016. In their cases, they try to compare the urban sanitations in Turin, Italy, and Mumbai in India to generate both specific and generalizable insights, which can be applicable to global cases. So following their patterns, I try to compare like radically different contexts, one in Buenos Aires, another one in Accra, to see using the housing and infrastructure provision for informal settlements as a linkage and try to facilitate the learning. Some other cases also borrow this methodology, such as Robinson with colleague looking at Johannesburg, Shanghai, and also London, or Hillsborough in terms of looking at Albania, UK, and Uganda. To this case, specifically, I want to look at two perspectives. One in cultural variables, looking at the scale of the informality, and also what's the history behind, and most importantly, how does the public perceive of informal settlements? From the structure constraint perspective, I try to look at the government structures and also how the funding mechanism happen. Leaning on to look at the national and local level of the policy. To be fair, like there are so much ways to look at the two countries and cities, but these two dimensions has been argued critical in the literature, including the study by Al-Asai and also Neyman. Why I choose Accra and Buenos Aires, in addition to like personal preference, there are also objective reasons. Ghana is the second largest economy in West Africa, and Argentina is the third in Latin America. Their capital cities, Accra and Buenos Aires, they have crucial political and economic influence to that region. Also, in addition to the differences from all different dimensions, they also have a moment of similarity at a time of the financial system reform, economy liberalizations, and public sectors restructuring in the 1990s. So what was interesting is to know after this period of time of privatization and also neoliberalism, what's the policy coming afterward? And also what's the informal settlement policy change afterward? What's the factor driving those changes as well? Those are the critical moments I try to explore. So moving on, this is a general intro in terms of where the city are and in terms of the country as well. Accra in Ghana is a West African country. And so the compare scale in these studies is focusing on Accra Metropolitan Assembly, so-called AMA. It has 1.8 million population scattered around 140 kilometers square. The greater Accra region is a metropolitan area in Accra. It has 5 million and 4,000 kilometers square. In the counterpart, the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, so-called CAPA, has 3 million population scattering on 200 kilometers square. The metropolitan area, so-called EMBA, is 40 million and 13,000 kilometers square. Before we move on, I want to point out, if you look at GAR and EMBA, basically EMBA is a triple version of GAR. It's like 5 million to 40 million, 4,000 to 13,000. So the population densities would be similar. So we will move on to look at the Accra first. From the historical perspective, the scale and also the urbanization, about 60% of the AMA population live in informal housing, and such a number grew significantly during the 80s upon the adoption of structural adjustment program. I will address on this program later in the talk, but for now, let's just take that as an international loan program that Ghana borrowed from both the World Bank and the IMF. There is a unique phenomenon happening in terms of the urban sprawling. And as you can see on this top of the figure, expansion was driven by the wells over the urban skirt. At the same time, there is an inner city is occupied by the rural to urban poor that coming here to earn a living. According to scholars like Jeffrey Poller, there has been a growing call saying that there is differences between the informal settlements in Accra For example, there will be a group of the population living in so-called indigenous communities like Gamashi. But at the same time, there will be the settlements that have been considered as not being recognized by the state, such as Agbogbloshi. So there is a differences between the settlements. Whereas the everyday challenges to the settlements is that they're moving from the rural area to the city, potentially finding themselves not being able to join the formal housing and market, and essentially being trapped by the poverty. And more experiences could be addressed, like the perception side. I'm going to touch that in the next slide. From a perception perspective, according to, also similar to what Wang was talking about, the winners and losers perspective, the city is faced both a slum of hope, a slum of despair. The slum of hope perspective, seeing these kind of settlements as the transitional places, people come here because they have the base that meets their basic need for affordable housing. But at the same time, when they get enough financial condition improvement, they will move on to other places. The slum of despair is sort of having the stigmatizing the places with different names, because you are coming out of here, you are excluded from the housing market and job market as well. So this sort of being attached with the idea of dirt and disorder to be evicted, displaced. Both of the idea exist in the same time in the city. Moving on into Argentina. In Argentina, it is being said like the growth of the informal dwellers has been attached to the movement of migration, which can go back to the 30s, when the European first time comes to the city, settle down. Later, they've been replaced in the 40s with the rural migrants from different provinces coming to the Buenos Aires cities. The immigrants later on move on with replaced by other immigrants coming from other countries like Paraguay and Peru. The scale of the informality is dramatically different. Like today, there is almost 7.2% of the city population live in informal housing, which is mostly scattered in terms of the places called villa, which is the Buenos Aires term on informal settlements. They are located in the south side of the city. And there is a crucial moment in the past due to back to the 76, when there is a military government and doing the cleanse of the city, so eradicating all the informal settlements. But it come back after democracy returned in the 83. The everyday challenges to the villa dwellers is a little bit different from what we see in Accra. They face the land tenure insecurity, which is very different from what we see on the people in Accra. And also there's the second thing is being attached with the high crime rates, which I will talk about in the next slides. So from the public perception on the everyday livings to those changing experiences in villa dwellers, it was started by the 70s, when it was at the same time when the villa dwellers conceived as also the transitional places. People migrants to here to get the opportunity, and then they will move on after they move on, and after they improve their living. But it changed into the 80s, when there is a time the country having the economy hardship, and gradually the villa being marginalized with crime, drug, employment issues. And there on this sort of the earlier internal control by the neighborhood in the villa, gradually losing their control because of diversified population. Such a marginalizations kind of exist and remain even after 2000. For example, there is still, this picture is taken in 2022 in terms of the drug raid that has been executed in the villa. So villa is considered as places to be feared, avoid as well. So in summary, the settlements in Argentina, in Accra is considered as both positive and negative image, whereas the villa is considered only as areas to be avoided even today. Moving on to the governmental structure, the first one I want to touch on is from the Ghanaian perspective. There are 4 different levels of governments in Ghana. First is the national government, that's the first top there. The second is a regional coordinating council, so-called RCCS. The third one is a metropolitan, municipal, and district, so-called MMDAS, which is the representative local government. including AMA. The last one is a sub-district structure, which is include the town, zonal, and urban council. So that's a layer, the lowest one. The ANDA is responsible for a lot of different responsibilities, from providing basic services to revenue collections, whereas the district chief executive is nominated by the president and then approved by the member in the ANDA. The source of revenues to MNDA can be generally separated into both own sources revenue as well as intergovernmental transfer. And this DACF is so-called District Assembly Common Funds. It's a particular fund that has been designated to do the government transfer. However, the sharing formula is kind of still controlled and determined by the national government. In Argentina, there are 3 different levels of governments, from the national, provincial, and also municipal. But in the case of Buenos Aires City, CAPA is a little bit unique because it gets its autonomous status in '94. So that means that it's politically and administratively anonymous and getting the equal status similar to a province. The CAPA's responsibility is sort of also spreading out with a lot of different items, but it covers both municipal and also the limited provincial perspective. But there is an overlap, different regulation perspective covering from the municipal scale, province scale, and also federal district scale. And the chief of the government is directly elected by the residents. The source of revenue to CAPA also including both own sources taxes, but most of the taxes are still concentrated, collected by the federal government. But there is also intergovernmental transfer as well. With that, AMA as the local AMDA in Accra has a direct interaction with the national government, which, however, is similar to CAPA because of its autonomous status, making it a province city. So basically, its status is similar to the province. So there is a direct interaction with the Argentina national government as well. So that's only basically 2 levels of this structure. I'm now moving on to the policy perspective. This is a little bit busy, but the intention here is not to help you to read every word here. But this is the diagram, shows the collective policy from 1950 to 2020. The purpose behind is to kind of identify what's a policy being implemented at both national and local scale. In this case, is the Ghana in the top, Accra in the bottom, Argentina here, and Buenos Aires in the last one. So you can see a more clear version of this one in the paper later on. But before we move on, I will touch a little bit on 3 takeaways. First is that both countries, following this timeline, you can see there is a similar political uncertainty happened to both countries. In Accra, after its independence in the 50s, all the way to its last democracy in 90s, there is a tremendous couple different times of military coup happening in between. The similar happens to Argentina as well. Before its return of democracy in '83, there are a number of coups also happening in the past. The second takeaway is both countries has introduced neoliberalism and also privatization policy, so-called the Structural Adjustment Program back to the 80s and 90s. So both countries face the economic difficulties during that period of time. So they borrow the international loan from the World Bank and also the IMF with collateral requirements, asking them to open the market. So that's a free market policy in that regard. And one particular event happened later to Argentina. Is the Argentina Great Depression happened during the 98 to 2002. So that's the economic crisis. That's the tipping point. The third thing is the municipal autonomy. In Accra, AMA gained its autonomy in '92 when the last democracy happened. In Buenos Aires, gained its autonomous status in '94. So that's a couple of the takeaway I want to highlight it before we move on. From a national policy perspective, because we draw from this timeline, it's easier to us to find a trend and also the emergent theme about the different approaches that city and nations adopted to intervene the informal settlements. So for this one in Ghana's national policy, I'm going to highlight 3 different trends. First is the self-help housing fund, which in terms is to providing the short-term, the mortgage finance happening back to the 50s and 60s, try to for the households to purchase like the windows, the fans, the door, etc., for the people to house themselves. The second approach is the state-led housing, providing the housing products to the household. This project is kind of driven by the state. So they are kind of more often happen before the structural adjustment program because that there is a state-led policy. However, they are mostly unsuccessful because most of these project or budget are ad hoc. So when they are running out of money, they are running out of money. And it's such a program kind of decline after the structural adjustment program, after the free market oriented policy, and try to privatizing all the housing developments to the private sector. The national housing policy is a very critical and interesting program introduced in 2015, try to encourage the community self-organize and to get the borrower to find finance himself and house himself with and repay the loan. So that's for the governments to being as an enabler in the market, still for the housing market to be dominated by the private market. The last one is slum upgrading. But these things, it's only becoming a discussed topic recently because the land tenure security was not a severe, hot discussed topic in the past. The major upgrading, however, in the country is kind of initiated with other partners, such as the World Bank and also with the UN Habitat. One of the interesting administrative reform was driven by the Ministry of the Inner City and Zongo Development. And that was set up, the Zongo here representing, let's put it, for now, it's just assuming that this places with Islamic population. Today is used interchangeably with the representation of the settlements. So, but this kind of reform is trying to help intervene in the inner city area, as always as a Zongo area. But it didn't stay long, it was dismissed last year. Into the city, from the AMA perspective, here I kind of collectively find out the emerging thing, not necessarily policy, but the experimental, but empirical experience that the settlement has gone through. The first one is the tolerance. So the AMA was authorized to being able to eradicate the unauthorized building. So that means that they could take out the building if that does not go through the building code applications. However, this sort of the slum will sort of be ignored in the period of time because they will consider they will move back to the rural area in the future. It take a shift in 2010 when the new urban policy was introduced, and with also a new mayors to the AMA. So to enforce the special order, the idea is try to evict all the from the settlements to the city, inner city street hawkers. But that was a movement in that period of time. One of the critical examples would be the eviction of Agbo and Ofarama that has been evicted 3 times for the settlements from '92. The last one is the slum upgrading. One of the critical projects is a community managed fund by the UN Habitat. And that was seek to empower the communities to take over and then try to with the initial fund from AMA and the UN Habitat, and to provide the informal settlements with public infrastructure such as electricity and water. But the program didn't scale up. Next, we move on to Argentina at a national policy. First, it's also similar to what we noticed earlier in Accra. There is a state-led housing unit, and that was a time when housing was a public work. And one interesting finding from the Argentina perspective is that most of the policy is kind of aligned with the progress of development that country has go through. So we can kind of find out the period of time they've been installed. And before the '83, that was the time when the military governments try to also see slum as a problem and try to eradicate it and build new housing. So for NABI, which is a critical program introduced, is a housing fund set up in '72, was trying to produce the new housing for middle income, but that was not for the low income community. It took a shift in the '80s and '90s when the new urbanism, privatization policy and neoliberal policy being introduced. And that was a time housing becomes the private work. And so the country run into also difficulties because the earlier military left tremendous foreign debt to the country. So that was also forcing the countries to introduce structural adjustment program as well. And that period of time, policy on housing tried to also decentralize from the federal level down to the province level. But not every province has the capacity to do that as well. So the privatization essentially cut off the FONAVI project. And at the same time, it's also introducing a lot of international actors coming to here and try to produce a housing, but that was not for low-income population as well. There is a shift after the economic crisis we addressed earlier during the early 2000s. The diversification was led by the introduction of the new government. Because of the decentralization, there is more calling for more action from the government. So the diversification was introduced with a pivotal project. It's called Federal Housing Plan. It's an ambitious goal, try to reach about 120,000 for the first phases, and the second phase is for 300,000 houses. In this regard, the diversification comes with 5 sub-programs, like covering from the middle incomes all the way to the informal or shantytown dwellers. So that program is kind of enabling the informal dwellers being able to get the municipal benefits, etc. And another interesting program introduced lately is a credit program for family houses, so-called PROGREAR, which is a trust fund trying to support subsidies for the low-income communities of families. Moving into the CAPA, also from the 3 different emerging themes. The first one is a cycle of the eviction. So that was a deal time we talked about earlier. There is a military government also coming back for different democracy. So that's a different time of demolishing. And there is a period of time when there is tolerance and regulations, because it happens after the democracy and also when the country into the phase of decentralization, try to minimize the state's intervention. So what they do is try to only regularize the existing illegal land tenure. Attached to the diversification, the enablement coming afterward in the last stage, following the federal housing program, try to deliver social housing, but at the same time try to establish, which is an innovative program introduced by the city itself. It was a credit-based approach, so-called the Law 341. It's a housing loan, try to produce according for all the different social organizations coming to participate as agencies and also recruit all the members here and be acting as a borrower to borrow money to build us local housing. So that was a critical project that's kind of happening in the cities as well. Lastly, I want to address there is a Reurbanization Program happening starting from 2015. And that was a program trying to mainstream and also reduce the redundancy of different agencies responsible for housing. So in that policy, try to shaping the common future to the citizen as well, helping the city being able to negotiate with any external support from the other international agencies. So I think that's one of the programs that's kind of trigger differences as well. So this is a summary in terms of the arguments from these articles, trying to know how different they are and what can be learned. From the Ghana perspective, it's kind of changing from the proactive states to reactive states after the introduction of structural adjustment program. However, in Argentina, it also followed the same way after from proactive to reactive with the introduction of structural adjustment program, but it comes back to proactive states after the Great Depressions in the early 2000s. In the local governments, from Accra, it's from tolerance to evictions because of the introduction of the urban policy framework. At the same time, in Buenos Aires, it comes from the evictions during the military time to tolerance of the villa population after the democracy, and then try to integrate them after the Great Depression. Also, there is worth of noting that in AMA, it has not been empowered to deliver housing project, whereas in Buenos Aires, as autonomous cities, it's been given with the responsibility of providing housing project. So I think that's a critical differences from the governmental perspective as well. So here are some of the discussion and learning. one of the most interesting historical perspective to look at the two cases is that both Ghana and Argentina has subjected to neoliberalism in the 80s, but Argentina has been faced with critical moments of economy meltdown in the 2000s. So that followed up with a different policy model, get away from the free market model as well. Since then, tremendous differences have happened regarding how do they deal with informal settlement in that regard. And a couple of the lessons is more like a proposition at a stage and try to collect all the inputs from the audience as well. And thinking about how Ghana and Accra learning from Argentina and Buenos Aires in today's cases. At a national scale, I think there's one thing really interesting is about establishing a designated housing fund. In the case of Argentina, it's a FONAVI. And because you have designated one housing fund, that means like the issue of the ad hoc budget is not going to be happening that frequent in the past as well. The second is about the diversifying the housing solution, which is also what Argentina has introduced in 2003 about the federal housing program. And I think that's critical because it covers not just about the settlement, but also the middle income as well. So I think that's two of the directions I can really think about. At the local scale, one of the critical things is understanding how do you crystallize the city visions in terms of thinking how Buenos Aires has introduced a reurbanization program that help the city to organize different resources to make sure whatever plan we want to implement it is going to follow with the city vision. Also, there's a need to learn about the credit-based collective mortgage. I think this is going to be very helpful for the helping the household in Accra to get a sufficient financial support to provide local housing. Some conclusion. I think the Buenos Aires in this comparison shows more inclusive policy on informal dwellers than Accra and Ghana today, based upon the time frame that we look at and also the topic we located today. Although there is one interesting contrast that happened in Buenos Aires is that even though the visa has been perceived as a no-go area, the inhabitants has been tolerant to stay and kind of also supported with different financial housing project implementation, etc., try to integrate them. This contrast between what had been conceived versus what had been done to them. I think that's an interesting dynamic behind can be further explored. The neoliberal policy model in Ghana, which is still followed today, has sort of limited the local government's capacity and their willingness to do more interventions to the informal settlements as well. If you think of the comparison between the PAVE program in Kappa versus what AMA has adopted for the city beautification program, I think that's a very contrast in terms of one can follow in only a national policy, one is sort of being tried to creating more policies that kind of benefit, try to create an inclusiveness of the city. And there's a need to really contextualize the localized urban scheming, not just in Buenos Aires, but also for Accra, to think about what's your bargain power that the city can gain when there will be more interaction with international actors to make sure that any support, either internationally or locally, that will be helping the city become better places. From a methodological perspective, I think the experimental comparison is really helpful to really specify the insight that would not be able to highlight it without a comparison. Whereas this kind of cultural comparison or different topic, if we have the early exposure to the compared topic, that would be beneficial to create more in-depth insights after the comparison. So I think that would be a general intro of the talk for today. And I will welcome to any questions, comments, and suggestions later on. But before we move on, I want to thank a couple of the parties which has been really, really helpful over my research period. First, I want to thank all the professionals that I have talked to in this research, especially Professor James Mensah, Eden Koff, Graham Saba in Ghana, and Daniel Kozak, Adrian Zucchini, Gustavo Garden, Cynthia Goita, Lucas, and Alcina in Sisu, especially to Alcina Benzan for her tremendous research help. Second, I want to thank the School of Cities for the support of this fellowship, especially Director Karen Chappell for initiating the monthly meetings between all the different postdocs and help us to go through this process and try to maintain our passion in research and academia. Third, for my hosting homes in IMFG, for Piali to help me to really settle down in Toronto, Thomas Hedger for basically go through all the research activities I have go through in the IMFG. And also Professor Gerald Turley for his encouragement, mentorship, and accompany all the ways to this far, and all the other fellows I talked to. And especially thanks to Derek Innes-Lag for allowing this research to happen. I know this research has been difficult from the beginning because you have Asian scholars coming to do the research on 2 different countries, and I'm not even choosing Canada as my study subject. So whenever I come across with the argument that Toronto is one of the most diverse cities that I've lived in, I think of the IMFG's trust for providing these opportunities to study on a topic focusing on the inclusive in cities. I always have that appreciation in my mind. I want to thank Les about my wife and also my family, who I haven't been with for so much time. And that will be all for now. And thank you for listening to this talk.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was a great presentation, really interesting. And thank you for all the thank yous at the end. There are already some questions coming in, and please let me remind people to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to start, though, by asking a question. And at the beginning, and it's a bit of an academic question I'm going to start with, Andrew. At the beginning, you talked about the advantage of doing these comparisons, and you looked at the literature about why doing comparisons between different countries gives us some policy learning, and you ended actually with that as well. But there must be some challenges that impede policy learning, particularly between places like Accra and Buenos Aires. And in Ghana, you said that 60% of the housing is informal housing, whereas in Argentina it was 77.2%. It was much smaller. Different attitudes towards informal settlements, positive and negative in Accra, but mostly negative in Argentina. And you talked about the sources of, where people came from, and that was different. So what are the challenges that impede policy learning between cities like Accra and Buenos Aires?
Yeah, I think that would be, one is really about a political will, if you may. Thinking about, I recall one of the conversations I had during the field work, and that is attached to like the interviewee told me they're growing informal settlements and they moved to the city, but we didn't ask you to come. We didn't ask you to come here, so we don't need to house you on the implementation of any policy. And so I think that's one of the really interesting political will perspective to think of that. And that's also driving of why I think there's differences in Buenos Aires cases. Like there is you see them as places of no-go, but we try to still give you housing. So that contrast, why would that be acceptable in their perspective? So the first one, I think it's really about a political will to do something about it. The second thing I thought is really about the financial constraint, especially attached to the local governments in Ghana. Is sort of really determined by the funds they can accept in the unitary system. So, and that was kind of the formula in terms of how much money you can get. It's also determined by the national government. So there are so much they can do from the local government perspective. So really limited about what can be done from the municipal perspective in the unitary system. So I think that's one of the constraints, even though we know that would be some potential policy that would be helpful for them to intervene, but somehow practically how that can be happen need to be taken a second thought. So that's a general response in terms of why that would be difficult for learning after a comparison.
Okay. I have more questions, but there are some good questions coming in. So
Sure.
I'm going to ask them as they come. For a long time in Accra, spatial planning was not a priority compared to some of the other dimensions of development, such as education, poverty reduction, measured in monetary terms. Is this low interest in spatial planning linked to the structural adjustment? How did this contribute to the development of informal housing and settlements?
That was an interesting question. I'm not sure if I can answer that from my side, but I would say you are definitely right that the planning per se, there are growing literature, a lot of literature talking about planning, or particularly in Ghana, is that's not being fulfilled from what's been planned versus what's happening. So there is a differences, but that's true. And so, and also if that's kind of part of the concern from the structural adjustment, I think that's also true. But I think the adjustment program happened back to 80s. At a time, as far as I know, it's also involved a lot of the intervention program from the infrastructure perspective. I'm talking about from the drainage, electricity, and also water. And that's kind of driven, but led by the international actors. To a degree, that's not being engaged from the local government's voices to know what should be done and to incorporate the local opinions. So I think you are right, like spatial planning itself has not been kind of formally introduced and be followed through as well. And another perspective I thought was interesting is also how powerful the spatial planners are in that regard. One thing I come across is really about the financial support and also the local planners training has been lack. I'm talking about like you have 200 assembly, but you don't have that much. One assembly is a one local government, but they don't have a particular designated planner in that regard because they are lack of the planners who being able to on the grounds to do implementation of the plan. I think that's another dimension to look at why there will be some sort of a behind or not been catching up on the planning execution. But I think that's a general understanding of why there will be the reason. Yep.
Okay. There's a couple of questions here on land tenure. One is, are there differences in land tenure systems in the two cities? And what role has that played in the development of informal housing? And the other question is, pretty similar, does the existing legal framework for land tenure affect the housing policy? Ghana with a British background, Argentina with a Spanish colonial past. So could you talk a little bit about land tenure and
yeah, I think that itself can be, I will try my best, but that itself is a topic to talk about per se. But I think one thing could be for people not being familiar with the context here, in Africa, there is a chivalry, like custody of the land that being have the original owners. Let's put it that way. And that's sort of the original owners belongs to the local leaders and especially the chief in the indigenous communities. So that they are the rightful owners. So that's why we, in the end of the slide, we have something called store land. And that's particular information of that then land system. And there is, in terms of how that being transferred, it's kind of based on local context, the far I know, because the field I've been through versus the other places like the foreign and rural, that's a little bit different from what I can reach at that time. So that's another interesting thing could be further explored. But at the same time, I think in Buenos Aires, there is an interesting conversation on the invasion and land invasion and how did you with the scale. And I think there's a term is called asentamiento. Yeah, I think that's another kind of grouping with the different invaders grouping together, try to kind of follow in the rule, but occupy the unoccupied vacant area and try to build everything by themselves. And in the end of the day, try to apply for formal approval and becomes a township, etc., etc. I think that's an interesting cases. But all of them is just shows like the diversification of a land system. But I know there's a clear differences between the chivalry in Africa versus the one that is generally opens and having the legal process in the past and also even presence for them to be ending the tenureship in the long term.
Okay, thank you. I have lots more questions, but I'm going to take the ones that are coming in. Unless I misunderstood, you were comparing Greater Accra, comparative multiple municipalities, to Caba, which is one municipality within the Buenos Aires metro area. It would be helpful to explain this. So to clarify whether you're talking about Greater Accra with a bunch of municipalities and Caba, which is one metro area. In both metro areas, there's significant informality in the peri-urban areas where municipal capacity to address the needs of the settlements is much lower. So let's start by just, can you be a bit more specific about what areas you're looking at?
Sure.
What you mean by Accra and what you mean by
Sure.
Buenos Aires.
I only look at the AMA and CAPA. So that's one with the rightful jurisdictions and local representative, local governments. That's the only scale I look at in these cases. And so it's not kind of spanning up to the metropolitan area. I know the concern in terms of Greater Accra region versus AMA is very different scale. One is like covering not just about the urban, but peri-urban and rural area kind of spreading out. So that's not a scale I'm looking at. So that's just to clarify. And the second one is, sorry.
Well, that was the second part was about the
that's
significant
different.
informality in the peri-urban areas.
Yeah.
There's another question, which is one of the questions that I was going to pose to you. Can you discuss the differences in resources available to the local governments in both cities to solve these informal housing issues? Buenos Aires must be a lot wealthier and better resourced than Ghana. Does that make a difference? And that's actually my question. Do differences in funding sources for housing and infrastructure affect your findings?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's surely for certain, but I think we touched on this earlier a little bit. The two things: who's responsible for addressing the housing policy, and so that's why we talk a little bit on the unitary system and also federal system. And as of now, the AMA itself has sort of been predominantly determined the funding from the intergovernmental transfer, which is kind of account more than maybe 50% of that is coming from there. And they are not responsible for providing any housing solution or intervention, or even housing unit as well. So I think that's kind of limited about local municipal capacity to do anything as well. I think that's right. But however, if you look at a CAPA, surely they are more resourceful in terms of both collecting the revenue and also they are kind of the province status, similar status. So I think that's giving them more resource to interact and also providing. But I think one thing to be interesting to highlight is the idea of policy innovations, because I believe that the Law 341 is a critical model that can be learned in terms of calling from the social organizations, try to invent it, providing more housing by the local governments from the local sectors and organizations perspective. I think that's some sort of the idea that can really transfer. The issue is about how funding can be run through from the in AMA's perspective, but the idea of calling a more participatory process is something to be learned from, in this case, either with resourceful or not, actually. Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that Buenos Aires has more resources, but when you looked at the different sources of revenue, they looked pretty much the same. They didn't seem to have more types of revenues, just more revenues, or do they have different sources of revenue? And does that make a difference?
Well, I think I need to, for that, I think I need to take a look. I didn't go through that far in terms of the particular resources yet, but that will be something to look into, how that perspective really affected the policy per se. Yeah, but that's true. Yeah.
So you also talked about Buenos Aires being a city-state. It has the powers of a city and a province at the same time. What's the implications of the different governance structures at the local level in terms of what they can do in informal settlements?
Yeah, I think there's one thing interesting is um, the local government's leaders, how they've been generated, we put it that way. And I think one of the interesting thing is the in Accra is being sort of nominated by the presidents. So to that degree, it's sort of being still within the influence of from the central government's perspective, if you say that. But at the same time, you look at Kappa as sort of being directly elected by the citizens, etc. So that gives them more leverage to being able to do something differently from the structural wide. So you are not sort of being bundled, only following the rule from the central, etc., etc. So I think that's one thing I realized is critical to determine how much you want to do, or you just follow the passing down the orders from the central. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah.
Right. But does being a city and a province at the same time give them more power than if you were just a city?
Sure. I think we didn't. So there is an interesting dimensions to look further is really about. So how about the municipalities in Argentina, like such as one municipality in Buenos Aires province, and how do they interact with the informality? I think that's kind of some other cases, some external cases that can be used to compare with the municipalities in Ghana's perspective. Yeah, but that's another dimensions to look at that. But surely, because the autonomous conditions in Buenos Aires give them more resourceful, and also from the provincial perspective, that's why it's sort of having more interventions on the ground as well.
Okay. There's another question that's come in. Are either of the cities interested in how other similar cities have dealt with these problems? Were you able to ask either of the cities where they look to for ideas?
Well,
or if they look, or if they're even interested in looking for ideas from other cities?
Well, I think I'm not sure that much about the Buenos Aires cases yet. I think one of the interesting thing is the interaction with the international actors. How do they intervene? And in the case of in Accra, what happened in the operating project provisions of the initial fund from both the IMA and also the United Nations to support a operating project. I think that's sort of the guidance, if there's a support on that way, and that kind of interact. And how do they try to learn from the other cases? I think it's another question I need to, I don't know the direct answers to that, or where do they look to? Yeah.
This is ongoing research. That's fine. You don't have to be able to answer all of the questions, but you did raise the issue of international partners. And I'm wondering what role they play in terms of, the ongoing debate about eradicating informal settlements versus improving housing and infrastructure and more, making them more institutionalized or more regularized. So where do the international partners fit into this? And some of them may be on this call.
So I think that depending on the extent that the partners are involved, and also how the beneficiaries' interest, I think that could be influential from the international partners. Yeah, if you think of that, the opinions from the funding agencies will be crucial, and the counterparties, if they don't have the same bargaining powers to negotiate, I think that's where it becomes really tricky. So there will be many uncertainties that would lead to this kind of final decision, right? Like what policy or what strategies can be adopted there. So for example, a couple questions will be like, what do the funding agencies and the beneficiaries, what do they care about the most? Like that's basically common grounds, and whether or not there will be similar interests commonly shared between the parties, etc., etc. And what are the costs if the beneficiary accept the collateral conditions suggested by the funding agencies? I think that's all the critical questions related to determine what the role of the international agencies play in the end of the game, actually. Yeah, so I think that's a really open question, but really crucial as well.
Okay. At the end, you talked about what Accra can learn from Buenos Aires. But is there anything Buenos Aires can learn from Accra?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. But it's kind of the open question that could be answered with so many different ways, actually. But I think instead of really look at the deficiencies of the housing policy, I think it might be interesting to consider the idea from the cultural perspective. So some places, as I argued at the beginning, like in Accra, they are still considered as a transitional places, whereas that's the kind of perception is no more existing in Buenos Aires. So is it possible for like Villa in Buenos Aires to become places or opportunities again? Or how would that be possible? Or in what way, man, that's kind of the stigmatizations of the visa can be removed? I think that's not that's not really directly answer to the question yet, but I think it's a perspective of understanding that Accra are less that harsh to the newcomers. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Right. Okay. If there are no more questions, I'm going to ask a last question before we break. And it's a broader question now. So we've talked about what Accra can learn from Buenos Aires and maybe even what Buenos Aires can learn from Accra, but what can other cities around the world learn from your comparison between Accra and Buenos Aires?
Yeah. So I think I selected the two cities that's located in West Africa and Latin America, like respectively. So I think the review per now is really about demonstrating what's there. And that gave the specific details about what may be relevant and worth noted for the other like West African and Latin American cities, such as Lagos in Nigeria and Lima in Peru, to really think about how do they, finding if there is similar cultural perspective, whether or not they can learn from the policies with these two cities' experiences and countries' experiences as well. So I think that's where you can start it from that region, if that would be the beginning. Yeah.
So they should each look within their own regions. So you're saying other African cities should look at Accra and other South American cities should look at Buenos Aires?
I think that would be the beginning, right? That could be an interesting perspective, or even kind of following up with another sort of the expanding case studies to think about what the surrounding city is doing, as what the earlier questions that an audience raised, like where do they learn from Accra perspective, but at the same time, where could the other places learn from Accra and Buenos Aires in that region, the particular cultural similarity. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end, looking at other cities around the world and what they can learn from this. Thank you very much for your presentation on Accra and Buenos Aires today. For those listening in, today's event has been recorded and will be available on our website shortly. Please share it with anyone who couldn't attend, who might be interested in Accra and Buenos Aires in particular. And so thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your day.